Today I'm going to be sharing with you my solo queue support tier list. It's been a while since I've made one of these and a lot has changed in the game. So what I wanted to do was to make a tier list that doesn't just list every single support in different tiers. I wanted to focus on the absolute best and explain why they are that strong, and also to have a quick overview of how to build and play them too. So this video is going to be a bit of like a tier list and a guide hybrid for the best champions right now. I'm also going to be separating this video into sections of low elo and high elo. Now what I'm going to be factoring into this tier list is win rate, blind ability, how easy it is to blind pick the champion, and lastly, ease of execution. Now before we jump into the tier list, I want to just mention a couple points here. This is my opinion, it's subjective. This also doesn't mean that you can't climb on other champions. In fact, I'd rather you play champions that you actually enjoy, have mastery on, than just jumping on the strongest meta support. It's going to be better for improvement and for motivation for the long term. Otherwise, we've gone through many iterations of incredibly overpowered supports this year. If we think back to Senna, Camille, Jana, Nami, the list goes on, they have all been very powerful at some stage. Right now, nothing is really jumping out to me as absurdly broken as these have all been nerfed. So the power levels are just going to be a little bit less extreme. Let's get into it. Let's start with low elo. For the purpose of this video, this is going to be platinum and below. The first champion I want to talk about is Poppy. She's been at the top of support win rates for a ridiculously long time, so I think it's high time that I finally talk about her. What makes Poppy thrive is many different factors combining together. She counters mobility, which is the most obvious piece of her kit and her identity. She has that W that grounds and prevents dashes, and mobility is commonly seen in top and jungle and even sometimes the mid role at the moment. Despite recent nerfs, she still has insane burst. All it takes is one wall slam and you're going to be toast in the early game. Given that she is appearing in the low elo tier list here, ease of execution, it's very important. It is easy to understand what she wants to do and it's easy to execute it. You run around and you slam people into walls, and if you do that, it's probably going to work out. Another reason she's appearing here in the lower elo tier list is that you just take people off guard in lane with burst and with consistently finding solo kills even, because people don't really play around her threat of slamming you into a wall unless you start to get into the higher elos. All of this is complemented by her build, so she makes fantastic use of Bloodsong and of all of the movement speed items that supports have access to in the game at the moment, as well as having powerful roams and skirmishes. Solo queue is always going to be chaotic, but with so many objectives in the game, Poppy is going to have a great time roaming around and leaving lane, which can be a little bit tricky for her sometimes. Now she has two strong build options. She has a Hail of Blades page and she has an Aftershock page. So this Hail of Blades page here, this is when you want to kill the opponent. It has a crazy amount of early damage, and you back it up with Inspiration Secondary so that you can have your flash up more often to keep slamming people into walls, and taking Hex Flash so that you can extend your engage range. Using Flash, using Hex Flash, very important to extend Poppy's engage range because that's her main weakness with her threat. The Aftershock setup here is when you want to peel and when you want to be more of a disengager. If they have a lot of engage, if you have carries that are not the strongest early but they need protection and then they're going to really thrive in the mid to late game. I encourage you to feel both of these paths out when to take which one, but for low elo and if you just want to one trick one page, you can go Halo Blades. It's always going to catch people off guard. Having that burst is always going to be nice. But the disengage page is very easy to execute. You just be a little bit more defensive and reactive and prevent the enemy team from doing what they want. So both have their merits. The most typical build path for Poppy after the initial Bloodsong and Boots of Swiftness is Dead Man's Plate. The problem with Dead Man's Plate is that it is very expensive. So if you want to go Warmogs, then going Dead Man's and Warmogs, that's just going to be a tremendous amount of gold that you need as a support. So you can give it a try, and especially if your games go long enough, then this is going to feel fine. I suggest that you kind of choose between two different paths. You can go Dead Man's into just generic cheaper tank items like Locket, or you can go Trailblazer and then Warmogs, because that build path is going to be a lot more affordable. And the thing about Dead Man's and Trailblazer is that they both have equal mobility. Deadman's has a little bit more damage and a little bit more stats, but it is more expensive. In terms of what you want to ban if you want to start playing Poppy, you should consider banning pretty much whichever scaling enchanter or mage that you come across the most. If you're in like mid to higher elos, you're probably not coming across too many Xeraths or Vel'Kozes or Zyras or champions that can just kind of annoy you from range. In lower elos, maybe you come across them quite a lot and then you'd want to ban them. But in terms of the scaling enchanters, if you're seeing a bunch of Sonas or Sorakas or even Sennas, These are champions that outscale and have quite a lot of range and utility, and it's just going to be a little bit trickier for you than most other matchups. Final thoughts on Poppy support: rush tier 2 boots, rush your boots of swiftness, and then just run around and embrace skirmish opportunities without hesitating at all. Moving on to Nami now. She is a very consistent enchanter that is incredibly simple to execute. She differentiates herself from other enchanters due to that level of consistency that she provides. She doesn't need anything from anyone. She doesn't need a hyperscaling AE carry to buff like Lulu or Milio. She doesn't need to verse engage to get value out of disengage like Janna or Renata. She always has immense value from her W, from her E, and from her nerfed but still powerful item spikes. I did a Nami guide not too long ago. All of the points are still relevant. The items are just a little bit weaker, but not by too much. So for more in-depth coverage of Nami, go check that out. I'm not going to go in-depth for everything again here. The main idea is that you just want to embrace your identity of having really powerful skirmishes from a safe distance and just rushing your powerful items, and don't feel pressured to do too much else on Nami. Don't face check, don't go on solo missions, don't roam to the sides of the map too much because you're going to be quite immobile. Just do your thing. This is as close as you're going to get to playing League on easy mode. She is in low elo again because of that ease of execution. She is very blindable, and she's been top 10 support win rates for quite a lot of this year actually. Nami is so blindable that I don't need to talk about bans. You always stay alive and throw out powerful spells from safety, whether you verse really high threat supports or whether you verse other scaling support picks. You can consider banning hyperscaling enchanters though, as she doesn't scale as well as these other enchanters do. As we can see here, this is a win rate from game length. For Nami, she really has the most power with her powerful item spikes, with Echoes of Helia and or Mandate, and with points in her W and her E. A really basic approach to the game for Nami: rush your item completions, encourage your team with on the way pings to use your powerful skirmishes, but don't be at the front yourself. The runes, the items, the skill order from my earlier Nami guide is all relevant. Here's a quick visual. Next up is Rell. She is all over pro play, she's all over solo queue at all ranks. Otherwise, she just has a very overloaded kit at the moment. She is the best primary engage support in the game, hands down. She can lock down an entire team by herself for, around 3 seconds that isn't even cleansable. In the League of Legends World Championships recently, this is what Delight did to the entire enemy team. She has middling engage range, but she just gets past that so easily with Flash and with Hex Flash, and especially her Q Flash, which is very hard to react to, and it pretty much nullifies any tricky ranged matchups that she might have. Otherwise, she's incredible against melee matchups, as she can disengage every single engage support in the game with her Q or with her W for free, and then she gets an easy outscaling win conditions against them, and she also wins many extended trades with other melee supports due to her passive and due to her dismounted form when she has a shield and attack speed and extra attack range. She has very powerful skirmishes, and she has a relatively short Q and W cooldown for those longer fights that we were talking about. There's basically nothing bad to say here about Rell, there are only positives. Now, in terms of how we're approaching building Rell at the moment, I like to talk about 2 different Rell pages again. Now, I'm starting to lean more and more towards the Aftershock page. There is more room for error throughout the game, but if you want to be an absolute psycho and go the Psycho Glacial build, you can. You're going to have more threat, you're going to run around and get to fights faster. But for lower elo, I would recommend just sticking to the Aftershock setup for now. In terms of her items, you can choose between Celestial Opposition and Solstice Slay. I don't really mind. You can choose between Boots of Lucidity and Boots of Swiftness. Lucidity, for having that flash up as much as possible, is great. Swiftness, getting around, is great. You can even consider Solstice Slay if you want to be really greedy with the Psycho Glacial build. You can go Locket into Warmogs, you can go Trailblazer into Warmogs, and then we're just rounding out the rest of the build with generic support tank items. For the Psycho build, we're going to be embracing movement speed as much as possible. Boots of Swiftness or Symbiotic Souls, Solstice Slay, and then Trailblazer and Warmogs, and you can just start stacking Winged Moon Plates so that you can just keep running around as quickly as possible and eventually complete other generic support tank items. Please max Rell's E. Her points in W don't do anything. It doesn't give it a shorter cooldown, it doesn't give it more crowd control. E is going to give you a bit more damage, it's going to give you cooldown on the ability, it's going to give you utility as well. So we're going to max E and then Q and then W. A really simple approach to how you're going to win a game on Rell. Be a psycho in lane, Q flash versus ranged matchups. You can afford to be a bit more reactive in melee matchups, but you can still Q flash psychotically onto the enemy ADC. There's just less pressure to do so. Get comfortable with a Q flash into W chain CC. Otherwise run around skirmish and embrace your extended skirmish threat. Stay in the fight. Moving on to high elo, this is going to be Emerald and above for the sake of this video. Let's start with Leona. Now this is going to come as no surprise, but she has been in a great spot for a long time in pro play and in solo queue. She has gotten a recent direct nerf to her base armor and Warmogs as a rush item for supports, which she abused probably the best out of all supports, but she is still in a fantastic spot. She can thrive in messy extended skirmishes just like Rell can, but for her it's because of her incredibly short Q cooldown. Otherwise she has some of the best 2v2 kill threat that you can find in the entire bot lane. She has a very high base damage passive for the early game and a super spammable Q. She also uses Bloodsong really well, and this is probably a trend that you're noticing. If a support can use Bloodsong, they're just at such a big advantage because Bloodsong is the only support quest item that helps you to kill people, right? Celestial Opposition, more to survive, Solstice Slay, bit of utility, bit of survivability. Bloodsong, you engage, you can actually kill people. Other roles, they always complain about Leona one-shotting people and taking 0 damage. So I've always found that quite funny, but it comes from some element of truth. I talk about Leona as being the stat check queen. If you have the opportunity to take a stat check fight, right, are my numbers just going to be better than your numbers in a fight? The answer is almost always going to be yes. So take a stat check if you can. You have a lot of numbers, especially with the Aftershock setup that we're going to talk about. And if you don't, and if you just try to run away on Leona, she has no shield, she's immobile, she's just going to feel a little bit awkward in those situations. The main idea that you want to keep in mind for Leona is to posture to find a second or a third Q. If you just use one Q against another melee support's one trading spell, they're going to come out ahead. If you can find a second Q, you're going to be winning. If you can find a third Q, they're dead. So really posture, move between your spells, try to find that second Q. The reason that Leona is not in the low elo tier list here is because you can miss her E, you can miss her ult, and like I said, she has no mobility or no shields to help get you out of sticky situations like a Nautilus or a Rell, so it can be quite punishing. But with that said, she is a great engager, and finding picks through her ultimate, it's a very valuable spell to have because it has a high engage range, which is basically non-existent for other melee support engagers. For Leona's runes, there's just going to be a pretty standard Aftershock primary for engagers. There's going to be some flexibility with the secondary runes here. You can go Inspiration for Cosmic Insight and Hex Flash to help her have more threat in the early to mid game. You can even consider Sudden Impact and Relentless Hunter to give her a bit more oomph. With when she does find and engage, she's going to do a lot of damage, and of course roaming around faster is always going to be nice. And then for the lower elos, if games go for a very long time, you can consider Triumph and Legend Haste as well. In terms of banning for Leona, I would probably ban Braum. You never want to give the enemy support a really easy to execute identity to counter you. It's not like you can't do anything against Braum, it's just that Braum's job is really easy and you have much less margin for error than against other matchups. Moving on to Senna. Now Senna is such a strange support because she has such wild swings in power and pick rate. Riot is constantly tweaking her identity and her builds every other week. But since her rework in 14.16, she's had a pretty powerful Enchanter line, which has gotten nerfed significantly with good reason, but it's still strong. Her lethality line has fallen out of favor and her fleet footwork page has been nerfed too much. Thank you ADC mid laners for that. But that line has now been replaced with a few other options. You can go the normal Senna build over here, or for my favorite Senna build, the dopamine stack Senna. You stack Grasp, you stack her souls, it feels really fun. But it also is genuinely harder to kill, and when you verse a lot of threat, a lot of damage, a lot of engage, then being harder to kill can be great. You can consider taking bone plating over conditioning if you need to stay alive in lane more. Now for Senna's items, if we're going to be going the damage line, then Black Cleaver into RFC, and then literally Ultimate Bravery. I've seen basically any other items work past these two items. People like building Infinity Edge, people have played around with Yomus, with Moonstone, with Chempunk when they need heal cut, with Collector. If I were to really recommend a third item, I would probably go with a lethality item. I know that might sound strange since her lethality scaling in her kit has been removed, but the game is probably ending before the completion of a third item, especially if our first two items are more expensive than other typical support items. And Serrated Dirk is going to be the best kind of item component that you can have pre-third item completion. In terms of secondary runes, you can actually have a little bit of freedom. If you're going the Airy line, you're probably going to want to go Resolve Secondary, because this page is more about scaling up and healing and shielding your team, so that you can get the revitalized value from that page. If you're going the Grasp setup, you kind of need Precision Secondary, otherwise you're just going to run into some tremendous mana issues, so having Presence of Mind is a big deal, and then Legend Alacrity is just going to help your champion to do a bunch more damage. But you can also cook a little bit with the Jack of All Trades, Inspiration Secondary, and then you can consider cashback if you're building expensive items. For Jack of All Trades, especially if you're just going full ultimate bravery mode and building whatever you feel like, you can get a lot of stacks of this pretty quickly. You're going to get a bunch of stacks from the support item, from your boots, and then from Black Cleaver and Rapid Fire Cannon. These are all sharing unique stats, so it's going to stack up pretty quickly actually. Now let's quickly talk about the Senna Enchanter build. We're going to be going Bloodsong just like all the other support lines. You can consider Dreammaker if you really want to embrace her Enchanter identity with this build, but I still think that Bloodsong is just such a good item if you can use it well, and Senna can. So we're going to go Bloodsong into Boots of Swiftness, into Echoes of Helia, into Moonstone to really scale up all of our enchanting, and then Dawncore third for the same reason, and then after that we're basically just going straight back to Ultimate Bravery. Build whatever you feel like. Could be a heal cut item, it could be Redemption, it could be Rapid Fire Cannon, it could be Black Cleaver, whatever. So I know there are a bunch of options here. Choose your favorite. They're all going to have their own value, and I want you to have fun with this champion. Because there are so many creative lines that you can take, feel out what works best for you, embrace it and enjoy it. I will say that the Enchanter line is more consistent and it is easier to execute. You're just grouping up with people, pressing Q on your allies, pressing R. The DPS builds, they are much harder, and you need to be able to space and be a psycho. And it also has a much higher 1v9 potential. So that's the build that I go when I play Senna. I want to style on them, I want to do a lot of damage, I want to solo carry the game. A quick overview of how to approach a game on Senna. Look to dominate 2v2 ranged matchups. Look to outscale and survive melee matchups. If you're an Enchanter, group and heal your teammates and ult early so that your shield value comes through. As the DPS build, dominate 2v2 lane bot. Your rune setup should allow you to win both ranged and melee matchups if you use them intelligently. And then instead of just grouping and enchanting and being reactive, be an absolute psycho in the 2v2 mid lane. So after winning bot lane 2v2, you're going to shift towards mid. The enemy bot lane is probably going to shift towards mid, and then you're just going to go right back to dominating them in a 2v2. In terms of banning for Senna, she struggles against all-in probably the most, so high threat supports can be tricky. You can consider banning Pike or Blitzcrank. Otherwise, I recommend that you try out the Grasp and Bone Plating line to try and survive them better. You could even consider banning Kai'Sa. This might sound weird because Senna does quite well into Kai'Sa in isolation, but when Kai'Sa is paired up with a high threat support, then if you make one misstep, you're just dead. Okay, the next high elo support on this tier list is actually going to be Lulu. Now, I know I said that blind ability is very important, so you might be surprised to see Lulu here because she does kind of need to have a hyper scaling ADC with her, but this is why she is appearing in high elo and not low elo, which might be another surprise. While her identity is very clear, you buff a hyper carry, you annoy enemy melee champions and especially assassins. It's that buffing of a carry that makes this strat much more viable in higher elo. It's actually quite funny, every single rank that I checked with her win rate, it went up with the rank tier. It started below 50% on the lowest ranks, and it ends up dangerously close to a ridiculous 55% win rate in the Apex tiers. And the reason for that is that ADCs understand that they actually need to pick a hyper carry alongside Lulu in higher elos, and they have those champions in their pool, and they are actually good enough to carry given that they have a Lulu that is buffing them up, which is probably not the case in lower elos. So I very rarely recommend supports like Lulu who typically struggle a lot with being blind picked, as those conditions that I mentioned basically need to be met. Right now though, she's in such a strong spot, I just can't ignore it. She has found actually consistent buffs this entire season, but there was a huge buff with her ultimate in the knock-up duration, and she also has a very relevant buff with her passive base damage going up. So now her ultimate can be an initiation tool basically, and it's going to be a lot less dependent on just like interrupting a dash or keeping an ally alive. And the passive flat number buff help her out so much in all inning lanes. For Lulu's build, let's look at the items here. So this is just going to be a pretty standard build, except for, you know, rushing Ardent Sensor, which other supports aren't really going to do. This is of course because we are going to be playing Lulu with a hyper carry, and then that hyper carry is going to use Ardent Sensor very well. Then of course we're going to go Moonstone for bigger shields. Redemption is always a splashable enchanter item. We can chuck a Dawn Core in there somewhere towards the end of the build. Now, since she is in the high elo tier list, I actually want to encourage you to go a more aggressive lane dominant build with Nimbus Cloak and Scorch and Ignite. Her extended all-in is absolutely terrifying, and it is tragically underutilized. She can whittle down melee matchups consistently. She can all-in ranged matchups. And basically, you're just getting in someone's face, you're igniting them, you're sprinting forward, you're finding as many auto attacks to proc your passive as possible, you're slowing them down with your Q, and then you're going to win. If you're going to be playing Lulu in mid or lower elos, or if you just really want to embrace the more passive identity, then you can go Mana Flow and Gathering Storm, and you can go heal instead, but you're just missing out on a huge aspect of her kit's strength. The basic approach to Lulu is you're going to win 2v2, and then you're just going to keep a hyper carry alive in the mid to late game. She's easy to execute. Just don't try to be a hero. Be more reactive with your defensive spells. Don't face check, and you're probably going to win if you're paired up with a hyper carry ADC. In terms of bans, she doesn't need bans. Again, she just needs that hyper carry ADC. So I recommend that you hover Lulu early. You see what your ADC is hovering. You ask if they can play a hyper carry ADC. Otherwise, you can probably pick a different support. The last mention for high elo support here is Rell. She works the same in high elo as she does in low elo for basically all of the same reasons. She's just in a fantastic spot. I hope you found this useful. Please let me know what your opinions are in the comments down below. Please keep in mind that I couldn't mention every support because I wanted to go more in depth on each champion. So if you think there is another really strong support that deserves to be on this list, I'm all ears. Thank you for watching. Please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting if you enjoyed the video. For world-class support, coaching, content, and community, go to wtl.lol/cupcake.